The separation begins long before anyone can see it. It does not begin in adulthood. It does not begin after a great loss. It does not begin after a spiritual awakening. It often begins quietly, in places that seem ordinary, during years that appear unremarkable. While others move naturally into groups, trends, identities, and social structures, some individuals experience a strange and persistent feeling that they are observing life rather than fully participating in it. They learn how to function within the world, yet something inside them remains slightly detached from everything around them. This condition appears repeatedly throughout biblical history, across deserts, kingdoms, mountains, rivers, wilderness regions, and ancient cities. The individuals who would later become central figures in sacred history often spent significant portions of their lives existing at a distance from the societies surrounding them. Their journeys reveal a recurring pattern. Before their purpose became visible, their separation became unavoidable. The experience was not always physical isolation. Sometimes it appeared as emotional distance. Sometimes it appeared as cultural difference. Sometimes it appeared as a growing awareness that the values governing the world around them no longer matched the convictions forming within them. The result was the same. They found themselves standing in familiar places while feeling strangely disconnected from them. This pattern stretches across centuries. Abraham left the security of established civilization and moved toward unfamiliar territories. Moses spent years in the wilderness of Midian, removed from both Egypt and Israel. Elijah walked through isolated regions where very few shared his convictions. David wandered through caves and remote landscapes long before occupying a throne. John the Baptist emerged from the wilderness rather than the centers of influence. Even the ministry of Jesus unfolded with a consistent distance from many of the systems, expectations, and ambitions that dominated the surrounding culture. When these stories are examined geographically, a remarkable picture emerges. The most significant journeys often pass through deserts rather than capitals. The most transformative periods often occurred in isolation rather than celebration. The chosen frequently moved through landscapes that reflected their inner condition. Vast wilderness regions mirrored spiritual separation. Remote mountains reflected elevated perspective. Empty deserts reflected the stripping away of worldly dependence. Their lives became maps of a larger process. The feeling of disconnection was not evidence of failure. It was evidence of transition. Throughout history, societies have been shaped by common desires. Wealth, status, security, influence, comfort, and recognition have consistently occupied central positions within human civilization. Entire cities have been built around these pursuits. Entire empires have risen and fallen in pursuit of them. Yet those moving toward a larger calling often discover that their deepest concerns begin shifting elsewhere. The conversations that excite others may begin to feel strangely empty. The goals that motivate entire communities may lose their ability to inspire. Activities that once seemed important may gradually appear temporary and fragile. This shift creates tension. The chosen continue living among the same people, walking the same streets, working within the same structures, and participating in the same routines. Yet internally, their orientation has changed. Their eyes begin looking toward different horizons. Their thoughts begin focusing on different questions. Their priorities begin moving toward different destinations. The result is a growing sensation that they no longer fully belong to the environment surrounding them. This phenomenon appears repeatedly across biblical geography. Consider the wilderness journeys that dominate so much of sacred history. The wilderness was not merely a physical location, it represented a transitional territory between one identity and another. It was neither the old world nor the future destination. It existed between them. The chosen often found themselves occupying this in-between space. They were no longer what they had been, yet they had not fully become what they would be. Their separation from the world reflected this reality. Internally, they were moving ahead of their surroundings. Their hearts were traveling before their circumstances could follow. This explains why periods of disconnection often intensify before significant transitions. The old environment becomes increasingly difficult to inhabit because the individual is being prepared for a different landscape. Throughout biblical chronology, preparation frequently preceded revelation. Years of hidden development preceded public purpose. Long seasons of apparent inactivity preceded moments of historical significance. During those years, separation often deepened. Moses spent decades in Midian before returning to Egypt. David spent years fleeing before becoming king. Joseph endured imprisonment before authority. The interval between promise and fulfillment frequently contained isolation. The same pattern continues to resonate because it reflects a fundamental process. Growth often requires distance from environments that reinforce old identities. Transformation frequently demands temporary separation from familiar structures. The chosen, therefore, experience a form of internal migration long before any external destination appears. They begin moving away from the values of the world before they physically leave any location. Their hearts travel first, their convictions travel first, their perspective travels first, the rest follows later. This process creates a powerful feeling of disconnection. It can feel as though an invisible boundary exists between the individual and the surrounding culture. Conversations become difficult, motivations become difficult to explain, interests begin diverging. The individual may still care deeply for others, while simultaneously feeling unable to fully connect with the priorities that dominate many relationships. This is not necessarily a rejection of people. It is often the result of a changing orientation. Throughout history, explorers navigating unfamiliar territory frequently discovered that old maps no longer matched the terrain ahead. The same principle applies spiritually and historically. The chosen begin realizing that many of the maps guiding society no longer explain the landscape they are entering. As a result, they feel increasingly disconnected from the world that continues following those maps. Biblical history repeatedly presents this condition not as punishment, but as preparation. The desert was never intended as the final destination. The cave was never intended as the permanent home. The wilderness was never the ultimate objective. These locations served as transitional environments where perspective could develop without constant interference from competing influences. When viewed through the lens of geography and chronology, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Separation often occurred before assignment. Distance often preceded direction. Isolation often preceded influence. The chosen were not disconnected from the world because they lacked value within it. They were disconnected because they were being prepared to see beyond it. Their perspective was expanding toward a larger horizon. As that horizon became clearer, the limitations of their current environment became increasingly visible. This produced tension. It produced loneliness. It produced uncertainty. Yet it also produced clarity. The farther they moved into preparation, the more difficult it became to return completely to previous ways of thinking. History repeatedly demonstrates that significant journeys require leaving something behind. The Exodus required leaving Egypt. The return from exile required leaving Babylon. The missionary journeys recorded throughout the ancient world required leaving familiar regions and entering unknown territories. Every major movement involved transition. The chosen often experience this same reality internally. Their disconnection from the world reflects the beginning of a journey that is already underway. They may not yet see the destination. They may not yet understand the full purpose. Yet something within them recognizes that remaining fully attached to the values, ambitions, and expectations surrounding them is no longer possible. Their path is moving elsewhere. Their perspective is widening. Their horizon is shifting. And as history repeatedly shows, whenever a chosen individual begins moving toward a greater purpose, the first visible sign is often not arrival, it is separation. The distance grows gradually, not through dramatic events alone, but through countless small realizations that accumulate over time. A person may continue attending the same gatherings, maintaining the same routines, and interacting with the same people, yet internally an invisible shift is taking place. The world around them remains largely unchanged, but their perception of it begins transforming. What once appeared permanent now seems temporary. What once seemed urgent now appears insignificant. What once commanded attention loses its influence. This widening gap between internal perspective and external environment creates one of the most defining experiences in the lives of the chosen. They begin living in familiar territory while feeling increasingly foreign within it. Biblical history repeatedly reveals this pattern through the movements of individuals whose journeys altered entire generations. Their separation from the world did not happen because they hated the world. It happened because they could no longer fully identify with its priorities. As their understanding expanded, their attachment to many earthly pursuits diminished. This process can be traced across ancient landscapes and historical timelines. The cities of the ancient world represented power, commerce, influence, and human ambition. Massive walls, bustling markets, military strength, and political authority symbolized the achievements of civilization. Yet many of the most important figures in sacred history experienced their greatest transformations away from these centers of activity. The wilderness became a classroom. Mountains became places of revelation. Remote regions became locations of preparation. There is a recurring geographical theme that appears throughout Scripture. While societies concentrated power in crowded places, many pivotal moments occurred in isolated places. This contrast reveals something profound about the experience of disconnection. The chosen often discover that clarity emerges when distance from worldly noise increases. The further they move from constant distraction, the more clearly they perceive larger realities. This does not mean they permanently abandon society. Many eventually return to influence cities, nations, and entire civilizations. Yet before they can do so effectively, they often pass through periods where their connection to prevailing cultural values weakens significantly. Consider the long chronology of Moses. Born in Egypt, raised within the structures of power, educated within the systems of a dominant empire, he possessed every reason to become deeply integrated into Egyptian society. Yet history unfolded differently. After leaving Egypt, he entered Midian and spent decades in a landscape far removed from the centers of authority. Those years were not empty years, they were years of reorientation. The distance between Moses and Egypt allowed a different perspective to emerge. When he eventually returned, he no longer viewed reality through the lens of Egyptian power. His priorities had changed. His vision had changed. His identity had changed. The world he once knew no longer possessed the same hold upon him. Similar patterns appear throughout biblical chronology. Joseph's imprisonment separated him from the ambitions and distractions of ordinary life. David's years in the wilderness separated him from the comforts and expectations associated with royal power. Elijah's journeys carried him through isolated regions where dependence upon worldly systems became impossible. Again and again, separation produced clarity. The chosen were not merely removed from certain environments, they were being taught how to see beyond them. This helps explain why many individuals who feel disconnected from the world describe a growing awareness of deeper realities. They often notice how quickly trends change. They observe how fragile popularity can be. They recognize how temporary wealth, status, and influence ultimately are. While others remain absorbed in these pursuits, they find themselves increasingly unable to invest their entire identity in them. This creates an internal conflict. The world continues operating according to familiar patterns, yet the chosen perceive those patterns differently. The result is a feeling of standing slightly outside the flow of ordinary life. Ancient travelers crossing deserts often experienced a phenomenon where familiar landmarks disappeared behind them, while future destinations remained beyond the horizon. They occupied a space between certainty and fulfillment. This image captures the experience of many chosen individuals. They can no longer return fully to old ways of thinking, yet they have not completely arrived at the purpose toward which they are moving. Consequently, they inhabit a transitional territory that feels lonely and unfamiliar. Throughout biblical history, transitional territories played a central role in shaping destiny. The Israelites wandered through the wilderness before entering the Promised Land. Exiles returned through long journeys before rebuilding Jerusalem. Prophets often emerged from isolated regions before delivering messages that would influence nations. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Movement toward purpose frequently requires passing through seasons of disconnection. During these seasons, many worldly attachments lose their strength. The chosen begin seeing life through a wider lens. Time itself starts appearing differently. Historical perspective expands. Eternal realities occupy more attention than temporary circumstances. This change can make ordinary conversations increasingly difficult. Discussions centered entirely on status, recognition, competition, or material accumulation may feel strangely incomplete. The chosen are not necessarily judging others. Rather, their focus is shifting toward different concerns. They are becoming aware of dimensions that extend beyond immediate gratification and temporary success. The more this awareness grows, the stronger the sensation of separation becomes. Geography offers another powerful illustration. Mountains occupy a unique position throughout biblical history. Significant events repeatedly occur on elevated terrain. Mountains provide perspective unavailable at lower elevations. From a height, travelers can see routes, valleys, obstacles, and destinations that remain hidden below. In a similar way, the chosen often experience an expansion of perspective that alters how they interpret the world. They begin seeing patterns where others see isolated events. They begin recognizing historical cycles, spiritual realities, and long-term consequences that are not immediately obvious. This expanded perspective can intensify feelings of disconnection because it becomes increasingly difficult to share certain insights with those who remain focused exclusively on immediate concerns. The chosen are often aware of this gap. They understand that their perspective is changing faster than their environment. Consequently, they may withdraw further into reflection, observation, and preparation. This withdrawal is frequently misunderstood. Others may interpret it as aloofness, indifference, or isolation. Yet beneath the surface, a different process is unfolding. The chosen are adapting to a larger horizon. Their inner world is expanding. Their understanding is deepening. Their attention is being redirected toward purposes that cannot be fully explained through ordinary measures of success. Throughout sacred history, this expansion of perspective often preceded major assignments. Before leaders guided nations, they learned solitude. Before prophets addressed kingdoms, they experienced isolation. Before messengers influenced history, they spent time away from its centers of power. The disconnection itself became part of the preparation. It trained them to rely less upon external validation and more upon conviction. It taught them how to remain steady when misunderstood. It revealed which priorities would endure and which would eventually disappear. This is one reason the chosen often feel disconnected even when surrounded by people. The issue is not physical proximity. The issue is alignment. Their hearts are orienting toward a destination that many around them cannot yet see. They are moving according to a different compass. Their journey follows a different trajectory. As a result, they frequently experience a loneliness that cannot be solved merely by increasing social interaction. The separation exists at the level of perspective. Their vision is changing. Their understanding is changing. Their priorities are changing. Historical journeys across deserts, mountains, rivers, and wilderness regions reveal that transition always involves leaving one landscape before entering another. The chosen frequently live within this transition for extended periods. During those years, they may feel disconnected from the world because they are no longer fully rooted in its assumptions. Their attention is being redirected toward a greater horizon. Their identity is being reshaped by a larger purpose. Their path is moving beyond the boundaries of ordinary expectations, and as history repeatedly demonstrates, whenever significant transformation is underway, the distance between the chosen and the surrounding world often becomes impossible to ignore. It is not the end of the journey. It is evidence that the journey has already begun. Eventually, the separation reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. What began as a subtle feeling becomes a defining reality. The chosen recognize that their relationship with the world has fundamentally changed. They still walk through the same landscapes, observe the same events, and participate in many of the same activities, yet their perspective now operates from a different foundation. The transformation has progressed too far to reverse. The ambitions that once dominated their thinking no longer possess the same authority. The fears that once controlled their decisions have lost much of their influence. The need for constant approval becomes weaker. The desire to fit seamlessly into every environment begins fading. Something larger has taken root. Throughout biblical history, This stage often marked the final period before significant movement. The years of preparation, isolation, uncertainty, and disconnection eventually produced a new clarity. The chosen did not become disconnected from the world merely to remain disconnected. The separation served a purpose. It created the conditions necessary for a broader vision to emerge. Looking across the historical timeline of Scripture reveals an unmistakable progression. Individuals were separated, prepared, redirected, and then deployed. Their journeys moved through identifiable stages. First came the awareness that something was different. Then came the experience of distance. Then came the season of preparation. Finally came movement toward purpose. This progression appears repeatedly regardless of the century, location, or specific circumstances involved. Abraham left familiar territory before becoming the father of a nation. Joseph endured separation before preserving nations during famine. Moses experienced decades of obscurity before leading an exodus. David passed through wilderness years before ruling a kingdom. The pattern remains remarkably consistent. Disconnection was never the destination, it was the pathway. Geography once again provides a powerful illustration. Rivers appear throughout biblical history as boundaries between one phase and another. Crossing a river often marked the transition into a new chapter. The Jordan River represented movement from wilderness into promise. Other crossings signaled major shifts in direction and identity. The chosen frequently experience an internal version of this crossing long before circumstances visibly change. During the years of disconnection, they gradually move from one way of seeing reality to another. Their values cross first, their priorities cross first, their understanding crosses first. By the time external changes arrive, much of the journey has already taken place internally. This explains why many chosen individuals feel detached from pursuits that once seemed important. Their internal crossing has already occurred. Their perspective now exists on a different side of the river. While others continue pursuing familiar goals, the chosen increasingly focus on questions of purpose, meaning, direction, legacy, and significance. They become aware that life consists of more than accumulation, recognition, and comfort. This awareness does not make them superior to others. Rather, it changes what captures their attention. They begin evaluating life according to a different framework. As this framework develops, the sense of disconnection often intensifies. The world continues measuring success according to one set of standards, while the chosen begin operating according to another. Throughout history, explorers who ventured beyond known territories often discovered that maps created by previous generations were no longer sufficient. New terrain required new understanding. The same principle applies to the journey of the chosen. They gradually realize that many assumptions accepted by the surrounding culture cannot guide them where they are going. The paths diverge. The destinations diverge. The priorities diverge. Consequently, their sense of belonging to the prevailing culture weakens. Yet this weakening is often accompanied by something unexpected. As connection to the world decreases, connection to purpose increases. Clarity begins replacing confusion. Direction begins replacing uncertainty. The isolation that once felt random begins revealing a pattern. The years that seemed empty begin displaying meaning. The delays that appeared unnecessary begin showing evidence of preparation. Looking backward across the timeline, the chosen often discover that every stage contributed to the journey. The wilderness was necessary. The waiting was necessary. The separation was necessary. The disconnection was necessary. Without those experiences, the perspective required for the next phase could not have developed. Biblical history repeatedly confirms this reality. None of the major figures entered their assignments unchanged. Each emerged from a process. Each carried lessons learned through separation. Each possessed a perspective shaped by distance from prevailing cultural assumptions. This perspective allowed them to act differently when decisive moments arrived. They could see what others missed. They could endure what others avoided. They could pursue what others considered impossible. Their years of disconnection had trained them for those moments. The chosen, therefore, occupy a unique position in history. They stand between two worlds. One world is defined by immediate concerns, temporary ambitions, and visible circumstances. The other is defined by purpose, conviction, and a vision extending beyond the present moment. During periods of preparation, they often feel caught between these realities. They no longer fully belong to the first world, yet they have not completely entered the second. This in-between condition explains much of the loneliness associated with the journey. Yet history demonstrates that this loneliness often precedes remarkable movement. The great journeys of Scripture rarely began with certainty. They began with departure. They began with leaving behind familiar structures and entering unknown territory. The chosen experience a similar departure internally. Their minds begin leaving old assumptions. Their hearts begin leaving old priorities. Their perspective begins leaving old limitations. The process is gradual, but its effects are profound. Over time, they become increasingly aware that their path is moving toward a horizon invisible to many around them. This awareness can create moments of deep solitude. It can create seasons where understanding feels scarce and companionship feels limited. Yet when viewed through the lens of biblical geography and historical progression, these seasons reveal a consistent purpose. They are not interruptions in the journey. They are part of the journey itself. The deserts, mountains, rivers, caves, and wilderness regions of Scripture all served as transitional spaces where identity was refined and perspective was expanded. The same principle continues appearing throughout the lives of those who feel disconnected from the world. Their separation often reflects preparation. Their distance often reflects development. Their loneliness often reflects transition. They are moving from one landscape of understanding into another. They are traveling from familiar territory toward a larger horizon. History repeatedly shows that those entrusted with significant assignments rarely begin their journeys surrounded by universal understanding and support. More often, they begin in obscurity, isolation, and uncertainty. The disconnection they experience becomes one of the defining features of their preparation. It teaches resilience. It teaches patience. It teaches discernment. Most importantly, it teaches them how to maintain direction even when external affirmation is absent. By the time the next chapter arrives, they are no longer dependent upon the approval of the world they once struggled to understand. Their vision has expanded beyond it. Their perspective has matured beyond it. Their purpose has begun pulling them forward. The feeling of being disconnected from the world therefore reveals something larger than mere isolation. It reflects movement. It reflects transition. It reflects preparation for a destination not yet fully visible. Throughout biblical history, the chosen repeatedly walked through this experience before entering the chapters for which they would ultimately be remembered. Their journeys remind us that separation is often not evidence of abandonment. It is evidence of direction. The path is unfolding. The horizon is approaching. The journey continues forward. And the very distance that once felt confusing becomes proof that a greater destination has been drawing near all along.